I think would be much healthier for the population as a whole if we could find a way to get kids to eat more healthfully and be more active, like they were when I was a kid and when my kids were kids. Even when my kids were kids, you look at their class pictures, they look skinny. There's hardly anybody in their classes the time when my kids were in grammar school who were overweight or pudgy or certainly not obese. And now it's completely normal. And so this requires a societal change if we're going to prevent this. We certainly don't want millions of kids on drugs that they have to take for their entire life. Maybe the drug companies would like that, but I don't think anybody else would.
Thank you for joining Restore Childhood. I'm Natalia, and today I'm really honored to welcome Dr. Marion Nestle, who was my professor at NYU when I was in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies almost 20 years ago. Dr. Nestle is the Paulette Goddard Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health Emerita at NYU. I was there in 2003 to 2007, and I loved every minute of it and have found every possible excuse to go back and organize alumni and just be in touch with the department because it was incredible. This department was the first of its kind. It's now 27 years old. Dr. Nestle is the one who founded it. She first joined the program in 1988 as the chair of the Department of Home Economics, which then evolved into other iterations in food and food management. And then in 1996 became the Department of Food Studies, which has an undergraduate and a graduate program. I was in the graduate program. Dr. Nestle is an award-winning writer. She's written 15 books on food politics and food policy, including her 2007 book, which came out when I was in the program. It was a very exciting time, called Food Politics, which has now been published in many languages and several editions. It explores the wide-reaching implications of what and how we eat, from production to marketing to the possibilities of a fair distribution of resources. Some of her other books are Unsavory Truth, How the Food Companies Skew the Science of What We Eat. She's also written about pet food politics, which is a book that I turned to when my dog back like 15 years ago was poisoned in the melamine scandal when Chinese melamine was put into dog and cat food, and many animals fell ill and ultimately died. So that was an incredible resource. And then she's written so many other books, but here is her most recent one, which is an autobiography that I'm really enjoying. I think it's incredible to hear about her story and also just her slow ascent to where she is now, which is really a resource for everyone in the food industry and an incredible, trusted, independent voice. So thank you, Marion, for being here.
Well, thank you, Natalia, for the nice introduction. It's always good to see you.
It's good to see you too. So I want to talk about your time at the Department of Health and Human Services. You co-authored the Surgeon General's Guidelines on Healthy Eating back in 1988. Can you tell us a little bit about what that report said and how the guidelines have evolved over the past 30 years?
Yeah, I mean, this was the first Surgeon General's report on nutrition and health and the only. And it was meant to be a consensus document about everything that was known about diet and chronic disease risk, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and so forth. It was a very lengthy project. I took it over. It had already been underway for several years when I took it over, and my job was to try to finish it off. I ended up writing most of it. And it said what dietary guidelines said. Choose foods with less saturated fat, salt, and sugar, eat more fiber, eat more fruits and vegetables. I mean, there was nothing particularly radical or dramatic about it. It was just that it was a big government consensus report. And there was another one that came out of the National Academy of Sciences the next year that said exactly the same thing. And both of these were enormous blockbuster books, hundreds and hundreds of pages.
What happens with those guidelines when after they come out? Obviously, you read them. I don't, and my friends have no idea, what they say. How are they disseminated?
Well, they're not really. I mean, the research in it was the underpinnings for the 1990s dietary guidelines. And so the guidelines that came out in 1990 said basically the same thing because they had all this research support for it. And the guidelines never change. I mean, they always say the same thing: eat your veggies and don't eat too much junk food. Basically, it's what it boils down to. But at the time, it was very controversial because it was the first government report that did this. And there were a lot of people who thought that not eating junk food would be very bad for business.
So can you talk a little bit about that? I remember in Food Politics, you talked about the fact that the stakeholders like the beef industry or the sugar lobby really would object vociferously if you said eat less of this. So it was always, something.
Yeah, it's un-American to tell people not to eat things. But a major source of saturated fat in American diets is meat. But the dietary guidelines never say eat less meat. They say eat lean meat, or choose lean meat, or choose low fat meat, or eat less saturated fat. And so you have to know that those are all euphemisms for eating less meat, because you can't say eat less meat. The meat industry gets too upset, and they're pretty good at getting what they want. So I was told on my first day on that job that the Surgeon General's report would never say eat less meat because it would make the cattle producers too upset, and they would complain to the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Agriculture would complain to Congress, and the report would never come out. And that was not a paranoid fantasy; it was a statement of reality.
Do you think that the guidelines are helpful to Americans, or do you think that using kind of these catchphrases or terms that most Americans don't understand, that they may actually be more confusing and leave more room for?
Yeah, I mean, I think they would be more useful if they were more direct and said what they meant. But in any case, the food industry has put fortunes into making people doubt the guidelines. I mean, look, dietary advice is so simple that Michael Pollan can do it in 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Really, that's all there is to it. You don't need to know anything else except that by food, he means real food, not foods that are now called ultra-processed. Foods with a lot of industrially produced, and you can't make them yourself. And they have a lot of junk in them. But it's really very simple, and it never changes. It never changes. But the government advice, the wording changes, or the way it's presented changes, or, it's under enormous pressure from food companies that don't want the government to say less of what they're making. They're not interested in public health. They're interested in selling products. They don't want the government to do anything that's going to reduce sales of their products.
So can you talk about the Farm Bill? We hear a lot about the Farm Bill. I'm not sure the average American or even parents know very much about it and how it influences what we eat.
Well, nobody knows anything about the Farm Bill because it's way too big. It's hundreds of pages in tiny print, all of which refer to previous bills. So the Farm Bill reads, you're going to amend section something or other of the previous bill to say something else. They're not readable. You really have to know a lot of history to be able to understand what's going on. The Farm Bill is a shotgun marriage and has to be understood as that. It's a shotgun marriage between agricultural supports on the one hand and food assistance programs on the other, because the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, is in the Farm Bill. And it's in the Farm Bill because President Johnson knew that he could get neither agricultural supports or food assistance passed unless he could get unless he could get senators and congressional representatives to understand that they couldn't have what they wanted without the other one. It's a classic log roll. So once you understand that, a lot of what's in the Farm Bill makes a little bit more sense. 80% of the funding goes to SNAP, 20% goes to agricultural supports, and the agricultural supports go to industrial agriculture, basically corn, soybeans, cotton, those kinds of things. They do not go to fruits and vegetables. So if you look at what happens to all the corn that's produced in the United States, roughly 45% of it goes to feed for animals. Roughly 45% of it goes to ethanol these days, leaving about 10% for food. That's our agricultural system in a nutshell.
And how do you think that impacts what our children eat?
Well, it doesn't do anything to make fruits and vegetables more available, accessible, and affordable. It does nothing on that. There are a few little teeny programs in the Farm Bill that promote fruits and vegetables among certain groups of people, poor people, and some others. But we don't have an agricultural policy that is aimed at making people healthier and making the environment healthier. That's not what our food system is doing. Our food system is there to support large industrial agricultural producers.
Are there other countries where they're doing it right and really emphasizing?
Yeah, the Scandinavian countries do it a lot, but it's always difficult because the power in the agricultural system is in states that grow corn and soybeans. And that's what everybody in those states does. And so those senators are really only interested in supporting their constituents. Iowa used to be like California years and years and years ago. Iowa was like California. It grew all the fruits and vegetables for the country. But now it only grows corn and soybeans, to the great detriment of the environment and a lot of other things. So, there are pressures from people who think this should be changed, but whether they'll get anywhere, I don't know. And they certainly won't get anywhere in this one.
Meanwhile, we keep hearing that more and more children are obese. I think the number I was seeing was 14.4 million children and adolescents affected by obesity. It continues to grow. During the pandemic, children moved less and spent more time sedentary. I know at one point the Center for Science and the Public Interest had an advocacy campaign about food manufacturers advertising to children via online platforms, which is very troubling. It's almost worse than it's ever been. You and I have discussed the new American Academy of Pediatrics guidance for treating children with obesity and overweight. And part of that treatment includes surgery and a lifetime of drugs, diabetes drugs, and that have severe side effects. What do you think about those guidelines? And also, I mean, you said it very well on your Substack, on your blog, that this was a downstream solution and we needed upstream solutions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm a public health person, and in public health, we talk about upstream and downstream. By downstream, the public health people mean that it's working with individuals. I mean, there's an analogy that's always given of babies floating down a river, and people downstream are catching all the babies. And then finally somebody says, where are all these babies coming from? Maybe we ought to stop this at its source. That's the upstream analogy. So you're working with individuals, and physicians who work with children who are heavily overweight don't have a lot that they can do. And so these drugs are being looked at by a lot of medical people as a solution to a problem that they haven't been able to fix any other way. Whereas I think it would be much healthier for the population as a whole if we could find a way to get kids to eat more healthfully and be more active, like they were when I was a kid and when my kids were kids. I mean, when my kids were kids, you look at their class pictures, they look skinny. There's hardly anybody in their classes the time when my kids were in grammar school who were overweight or pudgy or certainly not obese. And now it's completely normal. And so this requires a societal change if we're going to prevent this. We certainly don't want millions of kids on drugs that they have to take for their entire life. Maybe the drug companies would like that, but I don't think anybody else.
Yeah, I think that's really disturbing. And also the fact that I think we're really working hard to normalize overweight. And I absolutely agree that we shouldn't stigmatize anyone who is overweight, but at the
Well, it
same
is normal. It is. 3/4 of American adults are overweight. That makes it normal by definition. The average adult is overweight. Not necessarily, they're defined as obese, but certainly overweight. And the reasons for that are really pretty obvious. People are eating more. There's plenty of evidence that people are taking in more calories now than they used to. A lot more calories and plenty more calories, or certainly enough to account for the average increase in weight that occurred in the population since 1980. So how do you reverse that? That's really difficult. When junk food, if you want to put it that way, has become normalized, that's what everybody eats.
It's also the way they eat, right? On the go without sitting down and talking. I just saw a study somebody shared about families that spent an extra 10 minutes eating together and served. Who's got 10 minutes, right?
I remember, and this is a very long time ago, I would say probably in the early 90s, going to a nutrition meeting in which somebody sat me down and gave me some raw data, questionnaires that had been filled out by adolescents in a program she was running. And she had asked these adolescents to write down everything they ate for a couple of days and list the times at which they were eating and what they were eating at specific times. And what was absolutely amazing about those dietary records was that there were no meals on it. It was snacking from morning, it was a little of this and a little of that, and maybe 10 eating occasions a day. And all snack food, no organized meals at all. Rarely did they report eating more than one food at a time. And, it was the first time I had ever seen anything like that. And these were not necessarily poor kids. They were kids, some of them were from middle-class families. I mean, they weren't rich, but they were certainly from income distribution, within some income distribution. And I thought, well, okay. And the rules are that the more times a day you eat, the more calories you take in. The larger the portion, more calories you take in. And then of course portion size has become completely distorted because single foods are much bigger now than they used to be. Restaurant meals are bigger than they used to be. And so of course people are taking in more calories. And everybody, no exceptions, gains weight if they take in more calories than they need. Where genetics comes in is that some people gain more weight than others. But genetics didn't change in 1980 when everybody started putting on weight. The environment changed.
Well, that's why it's so disingenuous for the American Academy of Pediatrics to say this is an issue of genetics. I mean,
they don't say that. They talk in that paper about the environment, about the environmental issues. I mean, genetics is certainly part of it. But, it used to be, I mean, really, life has changed for kids so much. There's always talk now about helicopter parents, and people calling the police if they see kids walking to school by themselves, that kind of thing. I mean, I'm old enough so that my kids went to school by themselves when they were 6 and 7. Everybody did. There were parents stationed on the corners to make sure they didn't get hit by cars. And that was it. But of course, kids walked to school. How else would they get there? Or they rode bicycles. How else would they get there?
Yeah, you read the Ramona Quimby books by Beverly Cleary to my now almost 9-year-old, and Ramona was going to school by herself in the 50s when she was 5.
Right. Yeah, it's over there. Go. Right. And when I was a kid, which was really a long time ago, I lived in New York City. I had piano lessons in the village. We lived on the Upper West Side, on 115th Street, and I had piano lessons in the village. I took the subway by myself when I was 8 years old. You never see kids that young on the subway. You just don't.
I think that, with the Eitan Patz murder, kidnapping in the 80s and the hyper focus. I mean, I've spoken to Lenore Skenazy about this a little bit and hope to talk to her
There's
again.
no evidence that it's worse now. I mean,
no, I think the perception and the media's, hyper vigilance about showing parents how
yeah, but I mean, it's also part of the new the new parenting techniques. People at NYU Student Affairs Office complain that they're dealing with parents about their kids' grades all the time at college. Unfortunately, they're not allowed to, but they're still dealing with parents who are concerned about their kids' grades in specific classes. Come on, let these kids grow up, figure out how to deal with this stuff on their own. And when I was a parent of young kids, couldn't wait to get my kids out of the house. Go outside, play, don't come back until dinner. That doesn't happen anymore. And of course, it was before phones, and phones have made an enormous difference.
They have.
So I don't think it's easy to be a parent.
It's not. Really, and when people say just take the phone out of your kid's hand, it's
yeah, right.
Also, not first of all, it's not easy to do that. But second of all, you create you ostracize your kid. Like they're the only ones now who don't have it, and all their friends are chatting, and they're left out of it. So that is not a solution.
I think being a parent now is much harder.
I think it is really hard, and it's I have an almost 13-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I have to say it's gotten progressively harder over the past couple of years, especially since the pandemic. And everything is charged, everything is politicized. Parenting has become so politicized.
Good luck.
One more question I wanted to ask you was about freedom of speech on university campuses. I was struck by the fact that you said that when you were hired at NYU, you were a tenured professor who always had the freedom of speech and was able to be not intentionally controversial, but an independent voice who was never silenced. What do you think is going on college campuses now, and how do you see the future?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is enormous sensitivity among young people about issues of identity. And they play out in very complicated ways in the university, where students are extraordinarily sensitive to the kinds of things that they used to just shrug off, internalize, but maybe shrug off. I think there are some things about it that are really good and some things about it that are not. And it's going to take a while for it to play out.
Do you think that there's a chilling of speech for staff on?
Oh, I don't think there's any question. Comments on somebody's gender or does something like that, you have to be careful about what you're saying, how you're saying it, and why you're saying it. And I think there are some good things about that and some things that really are very difficult. But for people who've been teaching for a long time and have their ways of doing things, finding these kinds of responses to things that you've always talked about can be quite difficult. And I certainly experienced this myself the last time I taught, where I was talking about the rising prevalence of obesity and its causes and how it's measured. And there were students in the class who were extremely sensitive to the idea that the body mass index is an imperfect measure. It has racial connotations, and they reacted to it quite strongly. I mean, I found a way to deal with it that seemed all right and that got everybody calmed down. But, as I said, it's mixed. There are things about it that I think the kinds of issues that are being raised are worth raising, but it's how you raise them. And it's whether you raise them in a way that's respectful of other people's opinions or not, or assume that there's only one way of looking at these things when there is not. These are complicated issues.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Marion. I really appreciate your time, and I love the book.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for writing your story. I think it's so valuable to see, your path, and it is inspiring to others, and to feel like it's okay, like you can do things on your own timeline. I'm 51, so it's I'm kind of late to much of this too. So it's great to know that you went first. So thank you.
Well, as always, a pleasure talking to you.